How many people die every day? Over 153,000 according to WHO figures for 2012. If there really were a binary afterlife, eternally great or eternally bad, with no middle ground, is the heaven really all it's cracked up to be? We can be fairly sure that the intelligence level in heaven isn't high. All the great scientists are in hell for repeated heresies, as is everyone who can appreciate their work, the fact that we no longer think illness is caused by demons, and that the true nature of the world is revealed by actually looking to see how it works, rather than just saying that some magic sky fairy is responsible for everything. Remember when people thought rainbows were signs from God? No, neither do I. We've moved on since then. Well, most of us have. Everyone arriving in heaven will be wanting to meet their sky fairy, of course. After all, they've been promised that the stories are true, and they get to be in the sky fairy's kingdom, and what use would it be if they didn't meet the fairy himself? After all, how would you know you'd ended up in the right place without that? Besides, it'd be rude for the sky fairy not to thank you in person for your faith. But how long would your meet and greet last? If you believe in an afterlife, the chances are you think most other people are going to hell. How else are you going to feel superior as a fully grown adult who still has an imaginary friend? Let's say only 10% of people make it to heaven. That's still 15,300 people a day. The queues must be enormous, and the sky fairy must be bored rigid. Day after day, for century upon century, thousands of simpering sycophants queued up asking the same banal questions over and over again. Luckily for him, to get 15,300 people through the door every day and keep the queue moving, each stiff gets just 5.64 seconds to say hi and get their questions out of the way. Since you won't get time to ask any questions, perhaps there's an FAQ somewhere, maybe some kind of leaflet to collect on your arrival. One way for dead people to get more time for a basic greeting on arrival would be for the sky fairy to have representatives, like department store Santas standing in for the real Santa. So you don't really meet the sky fairy himself. He is, after all, busy being mysterious and making rainbows, and too busy to prevent disasters on Earth. So what makes you think he's got time to hear you asking whether you have to get your hair cut in heaven? In all likelihood, your meet and greet will take place with a rep. Crank up the bright light and some piped choral music, and the credulous will never notice the difference. After all, every Mickey Mouse at Disneyland is the real Mickey. Such a system could mean there's employment in heaven, so you go to heaven only to end up working pretending to be God to help manage the queues of snivelling creeps who want to ask that question for the umpteen millionth time. So you could choose a different religion. That's okay, you get to go to a different heaven, but every other religion's hell because you didn't subscribe to their sky fairy, who is obviously the only true sky fairy. But so was yours. So what is your afterlife then? Perhaps you are little more than Schrodinger's cat. Nobody knows whether you're in heaven or hell, or which heaven or which hells you might be in, and unlike Schrodinger's cat, we can't open the box and find out, and you only get to find out once you're dead. Of course, God-botherers will never entertain the idea that there could be more than one heaven, because that would defeat their black and white heaven or hell dichotomy, on which they base their sycophantic adherence to the cherry-picked musings of some Bronze Age camel fiddlers. If the dichotomy is correct, and there is only one heaven, then 40,000 plus sects of Christianity need not be wasting their time debating whose interpretation of the word of the Lord of the Camel Fiddlers is correct, since you're all going to the same place anyway. This pretty much renders your holy book and your interpretations of it utterly redundant. And since there's only one heaven, you'll have to share it with the people of other religions. So perhaps you'd like to take up your debate of who's picked the right God, the right holy book, and the right interpretation of that holy book when you get there. There's really no point debating it now, so kindly shut up and leave us all in peace. If you accept that there are different heavens and hells for each religion, then you're back to being Schrodinger's sky fairy sycophant. Take some comfort though, your afterlife superposition won't last forever, at least if you're a Christian. The Bible clearly states that only God is immortal. Obviously then you get to die again in the afterlife, and what happens then? Afterlife 2.0 presumably. Are you judged again by the capricious sky wizard, based on how much you kissed his arse while you were in heaven. If heaven is so magical, by what standard can you be judged when you die again anyway? You've already passed the faith test the first time you died, and that was pretty much the only entry requirement. After all, you can recant on your deathbed and still get in. So you die again and what? Pop up at the gates of heaven again like an afterlife version of Groundhog Day. Oh, but the queues. Well, it'd be rude not to join the back of the queue, unless there's an express lane for those who have died and been to heaven before. But there'd need to be a lot of express lanes, because they're going to have to serve everyone who has ever died, dying over and over again. Perhaps then there are other afterlife staff checking who's a first-timer, and who's a re-entrant in the infinite loop of life and death that results from only God being immortal. If you're a God botherer and you want to contend that this is nonsense and that you know what heaven is really like, or are at least able to regurgitate the content of the sales brochure, particular to your chosen religion or sect of that religion, you're forgetting one key thing. You haven't died yet, so you don't have the slightest clue. All you have is the promise that all will be lovely and fluffy. Will you be sharing heaven with all the sects and religions you disagree with? Won't you be going to their hell? How do you know? Oh, the near-death experience tales. If these are evidence of an afterlife, then they are evidence of multiple heavens, since, depending on where you live, your near-death visions are culturally appropriate. So what happens? Administrative error? You know the drill. Some relative is waiting at the end of the tunnel telling you to go back. Naturally, they had to take time out of their day in heaven to explain someone else's cock-up in bringing you to heaven's foyer in the first place. Sorry, it's not your time. Could you come back when you're older and not undergoing medical procedure? It's just that Yahweh's a bit squeamish about the whole open chest cavity thing, and it scares the children that he allowed to die last week. If you can be sent back from heaven because it's not your time, God's not perfect. He could have intervened before you nearly died, rather than inconveniencing heaven's admin department and taking your relatives away from whatever heavenly activity they were doing that day to say hello and then goodbye again. And of course, if heaven were really all milk and cookies, they wouldn't have endured the pain of missing you anyway. But what would their day have involved? There is no sea in heaven, so if you like the beach, fishing or marine sports, or just eating some nicely cooked fish watching a sunset with the smell of salt water in the air, you're screwed. Maybe you don't need to eat in heaven, so there goes your love of fine food. And if you can eat, the food has to be, by definition of heaven, heavenly. So you have no benchmark by which to enjoy a really, really good meal, because every day will be equally perfect. And equally boring as a result. Maybe they liked gardening. Well, no longer will they have to worry about pests or weeds. There are none. The soil is magically and perfectly fertile, so there's no real need to tend their plants. Gardening is reduced to planting seeds and watching them grow. With all the interest and challenges removed, that's probably going to be about as much fun as watching paint dry. Maybe they loved archaeology. Sorry, not allowed. Real archaeology would involve dealing with cultures other than the one specific to your heaven, which might present evidence that your sky fairy is just a tall tale used to keep people in line and sate their fear of death. Or perhaps the archaeological sites are all specially constructed to be culturally appropriate to the heaven you're in. So that'd just be an exercise in digging up confirmation bias, so where's the interest value in that? It's hardly likely to stir their passion for discovery that they had when they were alive. Again, heaven's looking contrived and boring. Don't worry, it only lasts forever, with the occasional re-death and re-entry to break the monotony. It seems then that if you think about it, the idea of an afterlife has more than a few problems. It's probably total bollocks, but we have no way of knowing in advance. People just think they do, and it always happens to coincide with their cultural and religious beliefs. Convenient, huh? Since this is the only life that you are guaranteed to get, you could just make this one count, instead of wasting your time trying to curry favour with your geographically predisposed choice of imaginary friend in the sky to try and ensure a good afterlife. Why? Because if one exists, and if your Sky Fairy is truly the reasonable, compassionate and genuinely loving fellow that his followers all make him out to be, while simultaneously ignoring his apparent penchant for genocide in the right context, he'll appreciate your efforts regardless of whether you spent your life kissing his transcendent arse by talking to the ceiling on a regular basis. Thanks for watching.